At least 15 presidents in the past have invoked the Insurrection Act, including JFK and George H.W. Bush. President Trump could be next as violence escalates in Minnesota from rioters and agitators targeting ICE agents and their operations. Joining us now to discuss this and some other headlines on Capitol Hill is our very own Washington Insider Armstrong Williams. Good morning to you, sir. We did a story this morning about the mob of rioters that actually invaded a church in Minnesota during church services, which critics point out show just how dangerous these agitators are if they're going to be invading a place of worship. So invoking the Insurrection Act would allow active duty military to be deployed for basically law enforcement duties. Meantime, Armstrong, even the governor has mobilized the state National Guard, although, of course, he hasn't deployed them yet. So what are you hearing on Capitol Hill?
Well, Jan, it is really an outrage that one of our colleagues, Don Lemon, would organize those protesters inside a church. It just crosses the line in such sacred places. And the only reason Tim Walz is calling up the National Guard to support law enforcement at ICE is because they know for a fact that he and the mayor have worked against ICE and have worked against the cooperation with ICE. And they're now facing a lawsuit by the Justice Department. And instead of encouraging people to comply, instead of pointing to defiance, it continues to escalate the situation, Jan. But law enforcement has to be allowed to do their jobs, but they must also do it with in mind that you got to always think about the community. A lot of them are being used as useful tools themselves for this chaos and this disruption. And this law enforcement must set the example, no matter how chaotic it must appear, but they must be allowed to do their jobs.
All right. And we're also talking about Greenland this morning. The push right now heating up for President Trump, telling European allies they need to get on board because, as he says, Russia and China are already looking to take over. There's nothing Denmark can do about it. So China already has some assets on the ground in Greenland. How important is it for the security, for the safety, for the survival really of the world, Armstrong, to be sure Greenland does not fall into the wrong hands?
Jan, there's no question that there's a lot at stake here. But strength without humility is dangerous. The Europeans are the president's allies. He should work with them in private without making these public declarations that escalate this situation, bringing about protests in Greenland itself. It's the tone of the president. He has to use better tactics. You can get this action resolved without behaving like no one else matters in this equation but you. That doesn't work. We don't need a world global conflict, Jan. And the president needs to check his tone and his tactics.
Right. And we also don't need China or Russia taking over Greenland as well. That also equally as dangerous. Wouldn't you agree?
You and I agree on that, but it's not about whether that will happen. Their allies will work with him to make sure that doesn't happen. But you got to see them as allies, not people that you can just push around and ignore and blindside them in your public declarations. You just can't.
And today, Armstrong, I want to make sure I get to this before we have to let you go. Across the country, there's going to be parades and celebrations remembering the life of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. How did his faith factor into his moral clarity of the time?
Janet, you know, I can literally remember on Thursday, April 4th, around 7:46 p.m. when my parents gathered us around the television to tell us that Dr. King had died and talked about his moral clarity and the fact that he was imperfect, but what he sacrificed and what we must do in terms of education and respecting law enforcement and being better citizens and leaving the world better than the way we found it. That's what Dr. King, even my parents, he was a strong voice in our home. It comes with accountability and responsibility. And so Dr. King still reigns the way he does today because it was morality, not about politics left and right. It's about following what we expect of ourselves, what was possibility for America that Ronald Reagan spoke about as that shining city on the hill.
Yeah, even when I talked to his daughter a few years ago, she would always say he was a man of God before he was a man of the people.
Yes.
That's what was most important to him. Washington Insider Armstrong Williams, always great to see you, sir. Thanks for joining us here on the National News.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chan.
Of course.